Allow me to tell you a bit more about the history and science that has gone into the generation of power currently enabling you to watch and listen to me on whatever device you're watching me on right now. Humanity has always needed power to keep ourselves warm, to get around, to light up our living spaces, and to harvest natural resources, but we hardly ever talk about the natural costs of all these natural resources, harvesting them and using them, especially for power generation. Welcome back, guys, to GCSE Minecraft and Chill, the series where I'm talking at you and playing Minecraft to entertain myself, and maybe you with the stories and bits and bobs behind the science and maths you need to know for your exams that fascinates me. I hope you're having a lovely day, that you've got a drink and something to do while we get into it. And today's episode is such a huge topic, and I swear I don't mean to say this in every single video, but really this story touches every topic imaginable, and I couldn't possibly cover it all in one podcast type video, especially because this topic includes my PhD subject. But let's get on with it while I am finishing up my roof and doing some exterior decoration on my house. So the history of electricity isn't just the history of energy and power generation. It's only one chapter in the story, and it just happens to be the focus of the latest volume, and so that is what I'm going to talk about. But before electricity, we had gas, oil, coal, and wood burning for fire. We had horse-drawn carriages, beasts of burden, and human power exploited physical labour, and we had water wheels and windmills, pulleys and levers, and all sorts of other creative, innovative ways of moving things, lifting things, cooking things, heating ourselves, doing work, generating power. So, the government's 2023 report on energy generation and energy use tells us that the majority of energy was generated by gas, and we were mostly using energy for transport in 2022. And really, in all of our history, our needs for energy haven't changed all that much. Transport and heating ourselves, or heating our food. Our need for energy and power isn't a modern tale of the Industrial Revolution and electricity, the internet and NFTs. It's not just that, it's tied deeply with our humanity and our relationship with the land and with life, and that's why it's such a huge topic of natural resource use and exploitation. Thinking about energy and power this way is also a sobering reminder that climate change, catastrophes, and environmental emergencies that we exist with in modern times is a recent and unnecessary thing. We have been using lots of energy from the beginning. There was no need for things to escalate to these proportions. And I say that to de emphasize this narrative that it's just the way that it is, that we just exist helplessly and powerlessly in this gigantic infrastructure where our needs for electricity, heat, and fuel for transport is somehow outweighing the need to live in harmony with an environment that cannot sustain the fuel that we are burning to supplement our energy use. All of the questions, obstacles, and barriers that come up in these conversations in the news, politically and societally, are that, well, renewable energy resources aren't stable, reliable, or producing enough energy to suit our needs, or it's, oh, the infrastructure is too complicated, too expensive, the tech isn't advanced enough yet. The thing is, these arguments have dominated the landscape for decades. After decades, do we really think that these exact same arguments are still the reason that we're not utilizing renewable energy sources, with all of the innovations and demands and concerns from scientists and focus on the renewables industry for years? Come on. So, one look at the research and development within the renewables industry tells a different story entirely. Scientists have been very passionate about tech advancements, problem solving, and tackling climate change for a sustainable future, and have been working on this stuff for decades. It's a personal frustration of mine because climate and environmental issues are what drove me to taking a career in science seriously. I was bombarded with messaging about climate change as a kid, and I had this desire to heal the world and restore our relationship with the environment utilizing modern science and ancient wisdom together, because I believe that's what it's going to take, right? And the thing is, the infrastructure exists, the numbers have been crunched. Utilizing a diverse portfolio of energy and power generation techniques to ultimately reduce and eventually almost entirely eliminate any dependence we have on fossil fuel would work. And I invite you, whoever's listening, to question why that isn't the world that we live in yet. Because I can tell you from within a research group that regularly collaborates with the energy sector, it isn't a lack of research or technological advancement capacity or ability to modify or use the appropriate infrastructure that we have. Anyway, off of my soapbox, back to the stuff that is more relevant that you need to know for your exams. So, gas, wind, solar, and nuclear were the UK's main energy sources in 2022. And energy consumption is divided into transport, services, industry, and domestic sectors. And the most energy is consumed for transport and domestic, which says something significant about the sources that we are still choosing to prioritize for our fuel consumption. And again, like I said, it's the story of humanity's been the same forever, moving stuff and heating stuff, right? Um, so we know that the domestic use of energy and power is a big one, and I'm sure you don't think about how your phones, computers, or whatever other devices are charged on the regular, or about the cables, generators, transformers, or pylons that supply your house with the power needed to make anything work. But it is significant and recent to have this vast nationwide capability of supplying the domestic sphere with this much power. Even 100 years ago, this would have seemed absolutely futuristically bonkers, but it's so ordinary to us that we don't even think about it on a daily basis. And the national grid is, of course, the name we give to this system of nationally generating and distributing power and individually supplying it to homes in small locales. So while coal powered the Industrial Revolution over 100 years before, the grid, not that one, this one, first came about in London in 1881 and was a hydroelectric powered electricity supply, mostly for street lamps. And then the next year, the world's first coal power plant started a chain reaction of electricity generating feats that culminated in 1926, the National Transmission Grid. So that's the story that we're talking about today. But the story of electricity actually starts way, way before then. An entire history of electricity is well beyond the scope of this video. You folks can check out Wikipedia for yourselves, but almost 4,000 years ago, people, particularly the Egyptians, knew about electric fish that shocked people, and the Baghdad battery indicates that, once again, Islamic scholars probably understood a lot more than we ever give them credit for in the UK and in the global north and west. And as with many others, the story of this modern scientific phenomenon has roots way more ancient than we ever talk about. But that said, I love a little bit of etymology, so let me tell you, the word electricity comes from the Greek word for amber, and that links us to a little story about ancient European, ancient Greek scholars' early experimentation with static electricity, which involved rubbing rods of amber on cat fur and then sticking feathers to it. They were playing with static electricity, and that led them to believe that the amber was becoming magnetic, like magnetic rocks that didn't need that friction effect to work. So, I don't know, the takeaway from that is that people have been messing with their cats like forever. Um, anyway, so many researchers are involved in the story of electricity, but probably the most famous from the thumbnail is Nikola Tesla. And of course, thanks to his research on alternating currents, transformers allowed the electricity generated at power stations to be transmitted over long distances and to rural areas, not just in cities. And this works by having whatever we've got generating the power, be it burning coal, oil, gas, wind, or the heat from nuclear reactions, whatever it is, as long as we have something generating steam to rotate a turbine or some kind of rotational force to turn turbine blades, that, as you will learn about in the electricity and magnetism parts of your physics course, is utilizing the generator effect to produce electric current. This current is then transmitted through wires and cables via a step-up transformer, which is taking the current down and the voltage up to the levels needed for long-distance transmission to minimize heat losses of moving so much current over long distances. So these transmission lines carry the current using pylons distributed all over until they reach the locality that they're destined for, and a step-down transformer then takes that high voltage back down, steps the current back up for use in our homes. And there's a handy equation that will tell you how to convert voltages and currents across transformer coils. They're basically an inverse ratio with one another, but don't worry too much about that. Keep an eye on my science revision videos for when we get to the electricity topic for more on that. But we're going to stick with the story of energy, power generation, and try not to, quite predictably, wander off on so many tangents already in this video today. So, to generate the power that we need, it often involves rotating the blades of some kind of turbine. This conveniently means we can divide up power generation methods into vaguely three categories. Bear with me, they're not perfect, but First, we have the burning stuff category, we have the moving stuff category, and then we have an other category. And the first one, burning stuff, usually involves, and would probably more accurately actually be called the heating water category, because that's what involves generating steam that moves in a pressure and thermal gradient to rotate some turbines using whatever various fuel, whether that's straight up just burning wood for fire, burning fossil fuels, or the heat generated from nuclear reactions. That's our classic power station model, right? What we all think of when we think of power generation. Moving stuff is a bit of a weird category. This is where I would put something like wind turbines, because the air is just literally physically moving the turbines directly, and all of the water ones are in this category too, right? Wave, tidal, hydroelectric, they all involve directly moving turbines with the movement of tides or water flowing because of gravity, right? And then we have the two odd ones out, basically. Geothermal, which is highly location specific and can heat a building if you put it in the right place, or you could incorporate the natural heat into a pretty high tech power station, but then you're just back into the burning or heating stuff category without the burning part. And the last one is, of course, solar power, which is using the directly photoelectric properties of light to power circuits. And the annoying or frustrating reality is that all of these methods are bad for the environment in some way or another. That's just inescapable. Primarily, I think, because of the infrastructure needed to construct the materials, the power plants, maintaining the national grid in the first place. You need concrete, steel, all of that stuff. And it cannot be understated how natural resource mining is greatly benefiting us here in the global north, while disadvantaging, genociding, and exploiting the global south, especially, particularly, I want to highlight the Democratic Republic of the Congo right now, because our entire attitude to natural resources, particularly in regards to power and electronics, in places like the UK has to change. It's just not sustainable or fair to keep exploiting the land and its peoples the way that we are, and expect to keep infinitely sustaining our lifestyles that use hundreds of terawatts of electricity every year, or of power every year. So, tangent aside, we are focusing on comparing and contrasting methods of power generation. And so, if we account for the inherent immorality or unfairness or unsustainability of the resources and infrastructure, what effects are we left with to compare and contrast impacts of each different energy generation method? Well, first off, the burning stuff category is pretty straightforward. We're burning stuff, so that means in every case we are emitting greenhouse gases. Apart from in the case of nuclear, which is a little bit different, you've still got infrastructure, you've still got mining to think about, but we have radioactive waste products to deal with rather than gases being emitted from a combustion reaction, right? So it's a bit different. And that radioactivity will be in wastewater, in the fuel rods themselves, and anything in contact with the reactor. And this is a pretty big problem, and I'm obviously pretty interested in this problem as it's the core problem behind my PhD thesis. What do we do with depleted fuel rods when we store them and they start to corrode, potentially risking leaking more radioactive material into storage environments? And depending on the storage location and the careful construction of these storage environments, this actually might not be as bad an option, or the boogeyman that people often believe it to be. But not going to go into a tangent about my whole PhD right now. Moving on, so then the moving stuff category, and the main problem with all of the water-based power generation methods compared to others is the impact that they have on the aquatic environments that they're in, or the trouble caused to habitats around the whatever structure of water, because of needing to control the flow of water inherent to that method of power generation. So you're obviously going to be disrupting the natural water cycle of the area and doing things like causing habitat damage due to flooding, or depriving areas downstream of water and natural cycles, as well as the literal physical disruption caused by suddenly having power generation infrastructure in a body of water, like think those massive hydroelectric dams, or turbines on the seafloor, or whatever it is. And that's kind of similar to wind, actually, still in the moving things category. The impact on avian wildlife is often cited as one of the big issues with that power generation method. And the physical disruption of the immediate area, whether that's on land or in water, cannot be understated in terms of its importance as a consideration, especially when we are leaning so heavily towards wind power in the UK, as a renewable and sustainable source of energy, or a green source of energy. Like, we've got to really think about, well, it's not like a perfect solution, right? It's about reducing and minimizing harm rather than leaning towards perfect solutions. Speaking of solar, solar energy has this reputation for being like this perfect solution. Um, Albeit the one downside, which is that we need sunshine for it to work, which we tend not to get too much of in the UK. But that's not the only downside, because whereas all the other generation methods require standard infrastructure and raw materials in their construction, like concrete, steel, and etc., that I mentioned, solar is probably, other than potentially nuclear, and some of the hydroelectric stuff, the only one that is really using advanced materials that require intensive mining, and rolling out in national projects, as the minerals used in the photovoltaic systems are not as common as iron. Um, so while you often think of silicon in terms of solar panels and photovoltaics, there are rarer minerals, metals, and materials involved, things like gallium, indium, sometimes niobium, as well as other rare earth metals involved in photovoltaic manufacture, depending on the type and brand, and all of the specifics. But while elements like gallium and indium are mined as byproducts of other more common resources like zinc, copper, and aluminium, they are less easily purified and put to use. And since the use of these metals has escalated rapidly over the last decade or so, production is not expected to keep up with the demand. So we've got important things like that to consider, natural resource stuff in general, as well as the issue of recycling or recovering solar panels after they've been worn out. So, like, people, when they're talking about waste and it's called downstream stuff in power generation, we usually think of nuclear or like the byproducts of the oil and gas industry, right? We don't often think about the byproduct of the solar power industry. So this isn't just me shitting on solar or anything like that. It's more like considering equally all of the generation methods. They've all got problems. And the thing with solar panels is that after they've been worn out, this could lead to a massive influx of toxic materials in the environment unless significant efforts are made to process and recycle the panels, to recover the rare resources they contain. And similarly to nuclear waste, dealing with expired solar panels is going to be one of the biggest challenges of using this method of power generation. And while I absolutely hope to see more renewable methods utilised to produce the majority of our power, I do caution that everybody think critically about reading about the advantages and disadvantages of any form of power generation, and that this doesn't mean that we shouldn't use that technique, but that we do need to invest equally in how we're going to deal with the waste, how we're going to make sure that that's sustainable too, as well as just the power generation method itself being sustainable. Does that make sense? I'm not going to get an answer, but I hope that makes sense. The point is, they all have drawbacks, and comparing them is actually quite complicated. The only clear conclusion we can draw when considering it is that we have decades of research backing up the imperative to absolutely stop using fossil fuels like yesterday, and whatever other problems we have after that with any alternative power generation method, we can and we will deal with, particularly with more research and technological advancement and investment in these methods, and by partnering democratically and harmoniously with the countries and people who are producing the natural resources, instead of having an exploitative relationship with them. Alright, so hopefully that covers everything that you definitely never wanted to know about power, the history of power generation, and a bit about the dangers and the dark sides of the future and present, really, of our natural resource use. For now, I'm just going to leave you with the reminder that your words are spells, so please be kind to yourself and have a lovely rest of your week. Again, thank you for being patient with me this week while I took a bit of a break and had a bit of an irregular upload schedule, and I will see you all next time. Yalla, bye.